Now, South African labor unions, including the Congress of South African Trade Unions and the South African Federation of Trade Unions, Saftu, have announced their intent to engage in strike action in response to planned budget cuts by the National Treasury. The unions expressed concerns that these cuts, set to be unveiled in the country's medium-term budget policy statements later this week, would disproportionately affect workers and vulnerable communities. Minister of Public Finance, Gonongwane, has proposed budget cuts for up to 15% in departmental spending as part of efforts to address South Africa's projected fiscal deficit for 2023, estimated at 4%. But Cosatu and Saftu leadership called on their members to oppose these budget cuts. So are we poised for another showdown between the union workers and the government? Well, joining me for this conversation, I have Trevor Shaku, who is a spokesperson, South African Federation of Trade Unions, and he's joining me from Johannesburg in South Africa. Thank you so much, Trevor, for talking to us. And we know that you're going to proffer answers to these questions. Hello, Trevor, can you hear me?
Thank you for.
So what is the nature of the budget cuts by the South African government at this point that makes it a reason for agitation by the workers? Because one would think that it refers to reduction in government expenditure and an expression of fiscal discipline.
Sure. Look, there are two sets of budget reductions. The first one is which they have already and always been rolling out. It has been incorporated in the budget policies in the past. But the recent one, which is actually the reason for us at the current moment saying we've got to declare a national day of strike to resist the budget cuts, comes with a memorandum which was circulated to provinces and the national departments, education and others, to say that they have to apply cost-cutting measures in order to maintain what they call fiscal stability. In our view, this is because government wants to maintain a certain form of a fiscal framework, and a fiscal framework that has for quite some time meant that they have self-imposed constraints on their ability to be able to spend on public goods and services. So they are then applying the cost-cutting measures, which include that there has to be a halt on the procurement of infrastructure. There has to be a halt in the filling of vacant posts in the public service, meaning that there should not be teachers, nurses, police, correctional service staff that are being hired into the government departments and to fill posts which already exist. The third thing is that the cost-cutting measures will include the halting of procurements of goods in contracts that had not yet been concluded, which means they will, in our view, have a negative impact on the ability of government to be able to deliver public services, because we are having a serious infrastructure backlog in the country. Hospitals are always full, with pregnant women sleeping in the corridors because the wards cannot accommodate them. In terms of goods, for instance, in hospitals and clinics, there are those pregnant women who have been reportedly sleeping on the floor because there are not enough hospital beds in those particular hospitals. There are not enough classrooms in schools. There are not enough desks for learners. There is not enough learning and teaching support materials that are supplied to schools. When you say that the departments must put a halt onto the procurement of goods, but also procurement for the building of infrastructure, what you are saying is that these public institutions must not deliver services to our people because they rely on goods, they rely on infrastructure, and they rely on their personnel to be able to deliver those services to our people.
But then, Trevor, when you say that the financial constraints were self-imposed, of course, by governments, we are talking about government expenditure that is said to have skyrocketed. We know that the South African economy is not as buoyant as it used to be. The South African government is paying debt. And, of course, there are other attendant issues. There's also issue of inflation, high unemployment rate, and other economic attendant factors that are actually inhibiting having a government to run its administration properly. So when you say self-imposed, I'd like you to explain that phrase.
Sure. So we think that South Africa has a high monetary sovereignty. What do we mean by that? We mean that South Africa issues its own currency. It levies a taxation in its own currency. It has adopted a floating exchange rate regime. It does not have a lot of debt that is denominated in foreign currency. According to the South African Reserve Bank reports, which were released at the end of July, shows that South Africa had accumulated debt that is denominated in foreign currency up to about between 80 and 90 billion US dollars. The rest of the debt is denominated in South African rands, which means we can never default on paying such a particular debt. When they come and say to us that we can't spend because debt has skyrocketed, what do they mean? By the way, the debt to GDP ratio, which by the way we think is a very useless, dormant method that these financiers and these people in government are using to try to apply fiscal austerity at all costs, shouldn't be used in the first place. The debt to GDP ratio is sitting at 70%, which means that it is not as high, even in their own context, even in their own terms, because there are countries which are flourishing. We hear no problems coming out of such particular countries about debt. It's for instance, Japan and many other countries. South Africa, on the rank of those countries with high debt to GDP ratio, ranks about number 70 in the world rankings. So we do not have a high debt to GDP ratio. These people are merely taking this because they fail to recognize that South Africa has a high monetary sovereignty, and this is because of the ideologies that government has and is using to determine its macroeconomic policies, its fiscal policies, and monetary policy. So in the context of South Africa and the analysis of the monetary sovereignty of the country, we think that government has the ability to spend on any good and service that is priced in the currency of South Africa, which is the South African rand. And to hire public service, are you going to be paying them with the US dollar? No, you're going to have to be paying them with the South African rand. Therefore, there's no constraint whatsoever to say that you can't be spending on hiring people in South Africa. For instance, the procurement of LTSM, the learning and teaching support material, most of which is produced by South African firms. Would you really be saying that you can't spend on those particular material because it is priced in the South African currency? So on the basis of this analysis, we are saying that the South African government is exercising a self-imposed constraint on its ability to spend on social services.
So when the Minister of Finance, that's Godogwani, now came out to say that there should be cuts of up to about 15% on departmental or department spending. So are you now saying that that probably would not be enough to help the country tackle issues of fiscal deficit that was actually projected for the country this year at 4%? Are you saying that these cuttings and these pruning downs will not help the country in any way?
That we shouldn't apply them. They would further depress the country. Fiscal contraction in the time of sluggish growth has proven to be very detrimental, not just for the delivery of services, which we already see, because our people are getting their hands amputated in hospitals. Our learners are getting a very poor education. A report was just released yesterday, a few weeks ago, that shows that South Africa's grade 4 learners, 80% of them cannot read for a meaning in English. In other words, the literacy levels are so poor, and this is because of lack of material that is required to ensure that education is delivered to our learners in those schools at a quality level. Secondly, our people are dying on deaths that could be preventable because there's lack of medicine, there's lack of infrastructure, and the general workforce in the health sector is tired and overworked, and as a result cannot deliver up to the optimum. So the fiscal deficit, so the cuts are already having a detrimental effect on the ability of government to be able to deliver those services. But on the other side, fiscal contraction has always shown that of sluggish, we will see those particular effects coming in because, for instance, the economists demand has dropped to about 10%. And one of the contributing factors to the underutilized manufacturing capacity in the country is because of the demand that has dropped by that 10%. Now, when you are actually implementing budget cuts and implementing these cuts on general government expenditure, what you are doing is to further suppress that demand, which will lead to further depressing the capacity of the industry to expand and for the capacity of the industry to be utilized.
Okay, so
it is
Trevor,
not going to help the country's development in any way.
So Trevor, now that workers are protesting about the areas through which government is planning on reducing fiscal expenditure, so what is the standpoint of Saftu, Cosatu and other unions? What areas are you suggesting that the National Treasury should focus on when we talk about printing excesses?
We're saying that the National Treasury must not administer any spending cut. In fact, we're saying that there must be more spending on government expenditure, because we need to save Eskom, which is our electricity supplying company. We need to save the South African Post Office. We need to save the South African Airways, which has already been sold for more than half. We need to save Dinel, which is an armored producing company in the country. We need to save Petro SA, which is a petroleum producing and processing company in the country. On top of these companies, which require a lot of government bailouts, you also need to ensure that you increase the headcount in the public service. The number of staff in the public service must increase. So we do not accept any spending cuts, and we are saying government, instead of cutting the expenditure, must ensure that it increases the expenditure. That is the reason why, as South African Federation of Trade Unions, we are proposing to other federations that we must go on a national strike to stop government from administering these cuts.
So, Trevor, when you say that the government should increase the funds or revenue for its expenditure, is it time now, quickly, just a response, is it time now for the taxing of the rich and probably the increase of corporate taxes to boost revenue realization? Because, of course, that's what some financial experts have suggested. Your response in just about a minute.
Yes, we've suggested taxation, but we've always maintained that government does not necessarily depend on tax to be able to spend. Those are the self-imposed constraints, and therefore, if in the context where we are, they think money from illicit financial flows, which amount to about 400 billion rands on a yearly basis, leaving this country because of corporate corruption, they should do that. If they think that they want to increase corporate tax, they should do that, as long as such particular burden will not be carried by the working people and the ordinary poor people of this country.
Okay, Trevor Shaku, spokesperson, South African Federation of Trade Unions. Thank you so much for your insights.
Thank you very much.